One of the very nice aspects of dealing with experienced speakers is they all stay to time and present the points. Hopefully you would agree with me just about as coherently as we can do it. When I first started in 1991 in Queens as a researcher in exercise science, and I looked at the people who were influencing the field, I certainly noted the name of Bill Hasall, and I remember thinking to myself once, boy, I hope one day I'm able to meet people like that, to be able to go and hear them speak and see what they have to say, because they're truly leading the way. Well, I've been very fortunate to be able to come to know Bill fairly well over the last few years for a number of reasons, and I think I can capture my own sentiment of that and many others by thinking that Bill is truly a gentleman, and he's truly what I consider the statesman of exercise medicine, sort of the chairman of the board, and thirdly, one of the most powerful forces that I know in terms of mobilizing opinion and knowledge and getting it together in the case that he will do today in terms of guidelines. So it's indeed an extreme pleasure for me to ask you to welcome with me Dr. Bill Hasall.
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the introduction. I was a little bit concerned about the introduction because the last 2 days, the group of speakers that have been up here have been grilling Bob about his current study and his future study plans. And at times, I felt it was good that he was at the other end of the table from us. Also, this is the first time, Bob, that I've ever seen an arrangement of speaker in which the arrangement is stratified by age, in which Dr. Church is first and I'm last. So anyway, coincidence here. What I'm going to do over the next 30 minutes or so is to talk about a process that happened in the U.S. over the last 3 or 4 years, and that's the development of really the first extensive federally issued guidelines for physical activity and health. Now, we know that over the years we've used guidelines and recommendations that have been very valuable by various health-oriented organizations, things like the American College of Sports Medicine, American Heart Association, joint efforts between organizations like ACSM and a government agency, the CDC. And in 1996, as most of you know, the Surgeon General's report was published, and while it was an official federal document, it didn't carry with it the kinds of requirements that a set of recommendations from the Department of Health and Human Services now covers. When dietary guidelines in America, you may know, get by congressional mandate have to be updated every 5 years. So we have dietary guidelines 2000, 2005. We'll have dietary guidelines 2010. We kind of within the exercise or physical activity health community really felt that it was going to be important, for some of the reasons that Steve has mentioned, to have parity in the sense of having federal physical activity guidelines that carried with them the same weight relative to policy, whether that policy is being made, you know, in health departments or whether in education or in medicine. We wanted guidelines in which every policy established by the federal government, if they're going to address kind of preventive medicine or health outcomes, they've got to take into account the existing federal guidelines. So my first comment is to just remind everybody that guideline development is a very dynamic process. So in the US, this process has really been going on for 30 plus years. And we've had a series of different recommendations and guidelines. And very frequently, and since kind of throughout my career, I've been fortunate to be in positions to play a role in that guideline development. I frequently have people say, you guys are at it again, changing the guidelines. Can't you make up your mind? You know, must be a group of old women. Sorry about that, but that's literally the kind of comments I get. Say, no, that's not the case at all. As science evolves, we need to stay with the science, and surely from 1996 to the development of the 2008 guidelines, when we look back at major scientific publications published in the English language, that includes American, that in a review of the literature, systematic abstracting occurred on better than 2,000 new studies since 1996. Now, all of those weren't published by Steve Blair. A lot of them, but no. So there's been a rapidly growing science space, and during my discussion of guidelines, I'll present a couple issues that are surely going to drive the need for updating and modification of the existing guidelines in the not too distant future. So the last kind of federal guidelines, as I mentioned, were the Surgeon General's report, and really felt that there needed to be an update. And the update was, one, is that there's a lot of new science. Two, the guidelines that we were primarily going on, which was the Surgeon General's report and the CDC ACS guidelines of 1996, had a lot of language in them that was somewhat confusing. For example, when the CDC ACSM guidelines were published, we thought we were pretty clever in going to say most days of the week. That allowed us, that's a weasel word. That allows us to hedge and not say, well, is it 4, is it 5? But the interpretation was, 4, 5, 6, 7, they're all most days of the week. So there was a fair amount of confusion about issues of that type. And then also, John Jakisik mentioned then the dietary guidelines of 2005, which were directed at macronutrients, so total calories in. And they felt like they really needed also to then address total calories out, and that's when they begin to address the physical activity and weight loss, weight maintenance. But those guidelines never got interpreted that way by most of the press. They said, again, you guidelines people are at it again. You tell us 5 times 30, and then you come back and say, no, it's 60 to 90 minutes a day in order to gain kind of optimal health. So it was really felt that needed new guidelines for those purposes. Plus, as I mentioned initially, we really felt it was valuable to get federally mandated guidelines that were, the charge to develop these guidelines came from the Secretary of HHS.